6%. That's how many people cholera killed in Chicago in 1854. 1 out of every 17 souls. Gone in a summer. And before that, 6 straight years of typhoid. Dysentery. Disease stacked on disease. The kind of death that comes from standing water. From sewage pooling in streets. From a city built on a swamp with nowhere for the filth to drain. Chicago sat barely 500 feet above Lake Michigan. Might as well have been at sea level. When it rained, and in those days before the drought, it rained, the water had nowhere to go. It just sat there, festered, bred death. The streets weren't streets, they were mud pits. Horses drowned in them. Wagons sank axle deep and stayed there for days. Buildings sat in pools of their own waste. Children played in water that ran brown with sewage. Women pumped wells that tasted of death. The smell, you couldn't escape it. Summer in Chicago meant holding a cloth over your face just to walk downtown. Meant watching your neighbor's kid grow weak with fever. Meant wondering if your family would be next. This wasn't a problem you could sweep away. This wasn't a problem you could legislate. This was physics. Water flows downhill. There was no downhill. The city was the bottom. So the question everyone was asking, how do you build sewers in a city that sits at the same elevation as the lake you're trying to drain into? You don't. Can't be done. Physics says no. Every engineer they brought in said the same thing. The grade is too low. The sewers won't flow. The system won't work. Best solution? Abandon the city. Start over somewhere else. Higher ground, better drainage, cut your losses. But Chicago wasn't going to abandon itself. By 1855, over 80,000 people lived there. It was the fastest-growing city in America. The railroads converged there. The shipping lanes ran through it. Chicago was positioned to become the hub of the entire Midwest. Walking away wasn't an option, unless you do something no city in history had ever attempted. Unless you physically lift the entire downtown core. Brick buildings, stone facades, marble banks, 6-story hotels, and jack them into the sky. It was madness. It was the only answer. And if they got it wrong, if one screw turned too fast, one beam cracked, one calculation missed, hundreds of tons of brick and iron would collapse onto the men working beneath, and onto the shoppers, the clerks, the senators still inside. What they were about to attempt had never been done. Not at this scale. Not with people living inside the buildings as they rose. Not with the weight of an entire city resting on threaded iron rods turned by hand. This is the story of the machines that raised Chicago, the men who operated them, and the impossible engineering feat that shouldn't have worked, but did. The question we're going to answer: how did 600 men lift 35,000 tons of brick, stone, and iron without killing anyone? And what did it take to turn screws 1/4 turn at a time while families shopped and senators slept above their heads? But first, you need to understand the man who convinced Chicago it could be done. Ellis Chesbrough arrived in 1855. He'd built the water system in Boston, studied sewers across Europe. The Board of Sewerage Commissioners brought him in to solve the unsolvable. His reputation was impeccable. His experience was undeniable. And his solution was insane. Chesbrough spent months calculating grades, measuring elevations, studying the flow rates necessary to move waste through brick tunnels. He traveled to Hamburg, Germany, a city that had solved similar problems, but Hamburg sat 40 miles inland on a river. Chicago sat on a lake at lake level. The physics were different, harder. When Chesbrough presented his plan to the city council, half of them laughed. The other half were too terrified to laugh. His proposal: construct brick sewers on top of the existing streets, cover them with fill dirt, raise the street level 6 to 10 feet. Then, and this was the impossible part, raise every building in the central business district to match. One alderman asked the obvious question: how? Chesbrough's answer: jack screws. The room went silent. Everyone knew what a jack screw was: a simple machine, A threaded rod, used to lift heavy objects a few inches, maybe a foot, not to lift 4-story brick buildings 6 feet into the air, not while people were inside them. But Chesbro had done the math. Distributed weight, load per screw, mechanical advantage. The numbers worked. In theory, the city council approved it. Not because they believed it would work, because they were out of options. The cholera death toll had convinced them, try the impossible plan, or watch the city die. Chapter 2. Iron Screws Against Gravity. The machine is deceptively simple, almost insultingly so. A jack screw, 3 inches in diameter, a threaded rod spiraling through a base plate. You slot a metal bar through the top. You turn. The screw extends. The load lifts. That's it. That's the entire mechanism. No steam, no hydraulics, just threads cut into iron and the mechanical advantage of a screw. One man turning one screw can lift 500 pounds. Maybe a ton if he's strong, and the threads are clean. It's slow, brutal. Your shoulders burn after 10 minutes, but it works. The problem? A 4-story brick building doesn't weigh 500 pounds. It weighs 750 tons. That first building they attempted, 70 feet long, 4 stories tall, situated at Randolph and Dearborn, was 750 tons of solid masonry, 1,500,000 pounds pressing down on wet Chicago clay. So they didn't use one jack screw. They used 200. 200 jack screws positioned in a grid beneath the building's foundation, each one supporting a fraction of the load, each one connected to a system of timber beams that distributed the weight evenly across the structure, and each one had to be turned in perfect unison. Here's why that mattered. If one screw turned faster than its neighbors, if one corner of the building rose 6 inches while another stayed put, the structure would torque. Brick doesn't bend. Mortar doesn't stretch. The building would crack down the middle. The walls would shear, and 750 tons would fold in on itself like a closing fist. The engineers knew this, the crew knew this, and the business owners knew this, which is why most of them thought the plan was suicide. But Ellis Chesbro, the engineer who designed the sewer system, had done the math, and he'd convinced the city that it could be done. Chesbro had come from Boston, where he'd built water systems. He'd studied the sewers of Hamburg, Germany. He knew gravity flow, he knew drainage, and he knew Chicago's streets were 6 to 10 feet too low for any of it to work. His solution was brutal in its simplicity. Build the sewers on top of the existing streets, then cover them with dirt, then raise every building in the downtown core to match the new grade. The city council, desperate, exhausted by disease, approved it. Property owners funded it. And in January 1858, a crew of men gathered at the corner of Randolph and Dearborn to attempt what most engineers said was impossible. They dug beneath the building, exposed the foundation, slid timber beams underneath, massive support structures that would cradle the weight. Then they positioned 200 jack screws at precise intervals, each one socketed into the beams, each one ready to bear a portion of the load. The setup took days. The lift would take longer, because here's the critical detail. The jack screws couldn't be turned all at once. There were 200 of them. Each screw had to be turned by hand, 1/4 turn at a time, and every screw across the entire grid had to move in sync. 1/4 turn, then wait. Let the weight settle, check for cracks, then signal the next quarter turn. The foreman walked the grid shouting commands. Turn! 200 men cranked their bars. The building groaned. Iron threads bit into their housings. The structure rose 3/8 of an inch. Hold! The men stepped back. Engineers inspected the walls, checked for hairline fractures, watched the mortar. If the brick cracked, they'd stop. If a screw stripped, they'd stop. If anything looked wrong, the whole operation would halt. But the brick didn't crack. The screw threads held. The building rose, 1/4 turn at a time, 3/8 of an inch, then again and again. The crew worked in shifts, 16 hours on, 8 hours off, Day after day, week after week, the business inside the building stayed open. Customers walked in, puzzled by the temporary ramps. Clerks sold goods while the floor beneath them inched skyward. No one quite believed it was happening. The movement was imperceptible in real time. But measure the doorframe in the morning. Measure it again at night. 6 inches of progress. They lifted that first building, 6 feet, 2 inches. It took weeks. And when they were done, when they'd slid new foundation walls underneath and lowered the building onto its new perch, the engineers inspected every inch, not a single crack, not a broken window. Without the slightest injury to the building, the newspaper reported. It shouldn't have worked. The margin for error was non-existent. One miscalculation, one uneven turn, one weak screw, and the building would have folded. But it held, and that first success changed everything. By the end of 1858, they'd raised 50 more buildings, some of them over 100 feet long. The engineers, James Brown from Boston, James Hollingsworth from Chicago, and a young George Pullman fresh from New York, had refined the process. Faster crews, tighter coordination, better timber cribbing. Buildings that once took a month now took 2 weeks. Word spread. Business owners who'd been skeptical now begged to be next. The raised buildings commanded higher rents, better storefronts, direct access to the new street level. The old unraised buildings, their first floors became basements. Their entrances sank below grade. Property values plummeted, but speed brought new dangers. The larger the building, the more screws required. The more screws, the harder to maintain synchronization, and the stakes kept rising, literally. By 1860, they were ready for the most ambitious lift in history. Half a city block, 320 feet of solid masonry row, shops, offices, banks, printeries, all connected. 4-story buildings, 5-story buildings, brick and stone fused into a single mass weighing 35,000 tons. An acre of city sitting on wet clay, and they were going to lift it all at once, while the businesses stayed open, while shoppers walked the aisles, while clerks counted money and typographers set press. The crew, 600 men. The tools, 6,000 jack screws. The risk, if the weight shifted wrong, if the grid failed, if the structure torqued, 35,000 tons would pancake onto 600 men, and onto everyone inside the buildings. But the alternative? Keep living in a cesspool, keep burying children, keep watching the city drown every time it rained. They positioned the jacks, 6,000 threaded rods socketed into a lattice of timber beams that spanned an entire city block. The preparation took a month. Engineers calculated load distribution down to the pound. They tested sample screws to failure. They mapped every weak point in every foundation. They built redundancy into the system. Backup beams, extra jacks, safety margins that would make modern engineers weep with envy. The foreman stood in the center, shouting commands that echoed down the grid. Turn! 600 men cranked. The screws bit. The block groaned. 35,000 tons shuddered and rose, 3/8 of an inch. Hold, check the walls, turn again. For 5 days, the block rose, 12 inches a day. Businesses kept their doors open. Customers walked in at street level, climbed temporary ramps, shopped as the floor beneath them inched skyward. One shopkeeper later wrote that he never closed for a single hour. Sales actually increased. Curiosity seekers came from across the city to shop in a building that was floating in the air. On the 5th day, the block sat 4 feet, 8 inches above its original foundation. Crowds gathered, thousands of them, and on the final afternoon, the engineers allowed spectators to walk beneath the suspended city, to stand among the 6,000 jack screws holding an acre of masonry in the air. Imagine it. An entire city block suspended above your head, 35,000 tons of brick, stone, mortar, furniture, merchandise, and human beings balanced on 6,000 iron threads. The screws groaned under load, the timber beams creaked, and you could walk beneath it all, staring up at the impossible made real. One witness wrote, "The sight defied comprehension. It was as though God himself had reached down and plucked the buildings from their foundations. Yet we knew it was not God. It was men and iron and mathematics, and the terrible knowledge that one failure would crush us all. They built new foundation walls underneath, lowered the block onto its new grade, and when it was done, not a single crack had appeared in the stone. Not a window shattered. The spectacle drew international attention. London's The Times called it an engineering marvel. Paris newspapers ran illustrated diagrams. Engineers from Germany traveled to Chicago to study the technique. But here's what the newspapers didn't report: the constant, gnawing dread. The knowledge that one stripped thread, one weak beam, one mistimed turn could kill everyone in the trench. The engineers didn't talk about that. They just turned the screws, quarter turn by quarter turn, until the city was high enough to survive. The following year, they raised the Tremont House, 6 stories, luxury hotel, over an acre of footprint, the tallest building in Chicago at the time, 500 men, 5,000 jack screws. They lifted it 6 feet, and they did it so smoothly that hotel guests didn't notice. One patron checked in on the ground floor. 3 days later, he checked out, wrote in his journal that something felt wrong with the stairs. The front steps had gotten steeper each day. The windows that had been at eye level were now over his head. He thought perhaps he'd remembered wrong. Perhaps the rooms had always been arranged this way. He never knew he'd slept in a building that had risen 6 feet while he dreamed. The question no one asked until later: what would happen when the city caught fire? Chapter 3. The Men Who Turned the Screws. There's no monument to them, no plaque. History remembers Pullman for his railroad cars, remembers Chesbro for his sewers. But the men who stood in those trenches, who cranked those bars 16 hours a day, who worked beneath suspended buildings that could crush them flat, they're gone. Nameless. We know there were hundreds of them, 600 on the Lake Street block alone. Laborers, most of them. Irish immigrants fleeing famine. German immigrants fleeing revolution. Men who'd come to Chicago for work and found themselves holding a metal bar in a cramped trench, staring up at 35,000 tons of brick. The work wasn't skilled. You didn't need training. You needed a strong back and the ability to follow orders. "Turn!" the foreman yelled. You turned. "Hold!" You stepped back. That was the job. But the margin for error made every man a point of failure. If you turned too fast, if you got ahead of the grid, your corner of the building would rise while the rest stayed put. The structure would torque. The brick would crack. The whole lift would stop while engineers scrambled to inspect the damage. And if the crack was bad enough, they'd have to lower the building, regroup, start over. Hours of work erased. Days of progress lost. And if the crack was too bad, if the building had torqued past the point of recovery, they'd have to evacuate everyone inside, clear the building, then watch as the engineers made the call. Continue or condemn? So you learned fast, quarter turn, stop, wait for the command, turn again. Your shoulders burned, your hands blistered, the bar weighed 20 pounds, and you cranked it 1,000 times a shift. You didn't think, you just turned. And you never, ever looked up, because if you looked up, you saw what was hanging over your head. You saw the underside of the building, the raw brick, the foundation beams, the tons of masonry balanced on threaded iron rods. You saw the truth. If a screw stripped, if a beam cracked, you wouldn't have time to run. You'd just be gone. The engineers knew the danger. They calculated load per screw. They tested thread strength. They built in redundancy, multiple screws per load point, backup beams, safety margins. But engineering calculations don't stop you from imagining what happens when 35,000 tons falls 12 inches. The worst job wasn't turning the screws. It was inspecting them. Every few hours, a foreman would crawl through the grid, checking each jack for signs of stress. looking for stripped threads, bent rods, cracked housings. His lantern cast shadows that made the iron forest look alive. The screws groaned under load, metal complained, and you had to crawl between them, close enough to touch, checking each one for the first signs of failure. If he found a problem, the crew had to stop. Lower the building slightly, imperceptibly, just enough to take pressure off that one screw. Replace the faulty jack, then resume the lift. The whole time, you were under the building, in a trench so tight you couldn't stand upright, surrounded by jack screws under load, iron rods compressed to their limits, threads screaming against their housings. One failure wouldn't just kill you, it would trigger a cascade. The weight would shift. Neighboring screws would overload. The grid would collapse like dominoes. And when 35,000 tons fell, the trench would become a tomb. It never happened, not once, not in a decade of lifts, not during the raising of 50 buildings in 1858, not during the Lake Street block, not during the Tremont House Hotel. 6 stories, 1 acre, lifted 6 feet, while guests slept in their rooms. But the men in the trenches knew it could. They lived with that knowledge every shift, and they kept turning the screws. Some of them gave the work nicknames, called the jack screws the devil's threading because of the sound, metal on metal, groaning under load. Called the grid the iron forest because of the density. 6,000 screws packed so close you could barely walk between them. Called the engineers the mathematicians of death because one wrong calculation meant burial. One newspaper account mentions a crew working under the Tremont House, 500 men operating 5,000 jacks in covered trenches, wooden scaffolding built around the foundation to shield them from weather and prying eyes. The hotel stayed open, senators walked the halls. VIPs dined in the restaurant. One guest wrote later that he checked in with ground floor windows at eye level. When he checked out 3 days later, the windows were over his head. The building had risen 4 feet, and he hadn't noticed. But the men in the trenches noticed. They counted every quarter turn, every groan of the iron, every shift in the weight above them. The pay was good. Better than ditch digging, better than factory work. $3 a day when most laborers made one. You worked 16-hour shifts, 7 days a week during a lift, and you earned every penny. Your back ached, your hands bled. You went home each night knowing you'd spent the day one thread failure away from death. Some men couldn't handle it. Quit after the first week, after the first day, after the first lift, when they'd stood in the trench and felt the weight settle onto the screws and understood, viscerally, terrifyingly, what they were attempting. Others stayed, became specialists, learned to read the screws by sound, could hear when a thread was wearing, could feel through the bar when the load was uneven. These men became crew chiefs, earned $5 a day, trained the new arrivals, taught them the rhythm, taught them not to look up. And when the lift was done, when the building sat on its new foundation and the screws were removed, they moved to the next site. Another building, another grid, another acre of city balanced on threaded rods. For 10 years, they raised Chicago, block by block, building by building, until the downtown core sat 6 to 14 feet higher than it had in 1855, until the sewers could drain, until the water flowed away instead of pooling in the streets. They raised over 50 buildings in 1858 alone. By 1865, they'd lifted the Robbins Building, an iron-framed structure weighing 27,000 tons, 5 stories, 150 feet long, 80 feet wide. The floors were packed with merchandise, heavy goods, machinery, inventory. The building wasn't just occupied, it was stuffed full. The engineers called it the heaviest lift ever attempted, 27,000 tons over a relatively small footprint. That's concentrated weight, pressure per square inch that made the timber beams groan. 1,584 jack screws to distribute the load, more jacks per square foot than any previous lift. The crew knew what they were facing. This wasn't like the Lake Street block, where the weight spread across an acre. This was a column of iron and brick and merchandise pressing down on a grid barely larger than a residential lot. The margin for error had shrunk. The danger had multiplied. Used 1,584 jack screws. Raised it 27.5 inches in 3 days. Without the slightest crack or damage, the Tribune reported. By then, the technique had been perfected. The crews worked like machines themselves, synchronized, efficient, deadly precise. The engineers, Hollingsworth, Pullman, Brown, had raised their fees, were turning down contracts, had more work than they could handle. Chicago was rising, literally. The downtown core now sat high enough for sewers to work. The cholera stopped. The typhoid cases dropped. Children played in streets that drained. The city thrived. And then the city burned. Chapter 4. When the Mud Turned to Ash, October 8th, 1871, 8:30 at night. A barn on DeKoven Street. No one knows what started it. A lantern kicked over. A coal dropped from a pipe. Some say it was Catherine O'Leary's cow. Some say it was gamblers in the barn. The truth died in the flames. What matters is this. Chicago had just survived the driest summer in memory. Only 1 inch of rain between July and October. The wooden buildings, the ones they hadn't raised because they were too cheap, too far from downtown, had baked in the heat. The streets were still wood. The sidewalks were still wood. Even some of the raised buildings, the ones with iron frames and brick facades, had wooden roofs, wooden supports, wooden interiors, and the wind was blowing. Southwest, 35 to 45 miles per hour. The barn ignited. The wind caught the flames. Within minutes, the fire had jumped to the next building, then the next. Fire devils, spiraling columns of superheated air, spit burning debris across entire city blocks. Embers landed on roofs half a mile away. Buildings exploded. The fire department responded. 17 horse-drawn steam pumpers, 185 firefighters. They'd been fighting blazes all week, 27 fires in the first week of October alone. The crews were exhausted, the equipment worn, the horses tired, and now they faced an inferno. They might as well have been pissing on a volcano. By midnight, the fire had crossed the Chicago River. It was burning north, burning east, eating through the slums, eating through the business district. The waterworks, built to bring clean water from the lake, caught fire despite its slate roof. The wooden structure beneath burned. The pumps died. The city lost water pressure. Now the fire had nothing stopping it. The wind created a firestorm. Convection currents pulled air into the flames, feeding them oxygen, creating a self-sustaining monster. Temperatures hit 1,800 degrees. Iron beams melted. Stone facades exploded from the heat. Brick buildings, the ones they'd jacked into the sky, the ones they'd lifted with such care, the engineering marvels, burned like kindling. For 36 hours it burned. 4 miles long, 1 mile wide. 17,500 buildings consumed. 300 people dead. 100,000 homeless. The entire central business district, the heart of the city they'd spent a decade raising, gone. Including the buildings they'd lifted, the Lake Street block, the one they'd suspended on 6,000 jack screws while shoppers walked beneath. Gone. Nothing but a foundation and ash. The Tremont House Hotel, 6 stories, raised 6 feet, lifted while senators slept. Ashes. The guests who'd marveled at the engineering. Evacuated or dead. The building itself collapsed into a smoking crater. The Robbins Building, 27,000 tons of iron and brick, raised with 1,584 jack screws, the heaviest lift ever attempted. The iron frame melted. 27,000 tons of building material collapsed into its own foundation. The sidewalk they'd raised alongside it, cracked and buried under rubble. Every building they'd raised, every structure they'd jacked into the sky, every feat of engineering that newspapers had called impossible, the Great Fire ate them all. Property owners who'd paid thousands to raise their buildings watched them burn. The raised foundations, the new basements, the fill dirt, the careful grading, all that remained were scorched walls and empty lots. But here's what survived: the grade, the elevation, the sewers. Because they'd built the sewers before they raised the buildings, they'd laid the brick drains, covered them with dirt, paved the streets at the new elevation, and those sewers, 6 to 10 feet below the new street level, stayed intact. The fire burned above them, the buildings collapsed onto them. But the drainage system held. The brick tunnels Chesbro had designed, still there, still functional. The flow rates he'd calculated, still worked. The manholes he'd installed, buried under rubble but intact. When the rain finally came on October 10th, when the storm rolled in and helped extinguish the last flames, the water drained through those sewers, away from the streets, into the river. Chicago didn't flood, even as the city burned, even as 100,000 people fled north toward the lake. The streets drained, which meant that when they rebuilt, and they rebuilt fast, within months, they didn't have to start over. They didn't have to raise the city again. They just built new structures on the new grade, taller buildings, steel-framed skyscrapers, the modern city. William LeBaron Jenney would design the Home Insurance Building in 1884, the world's first skyscraper, 10 stories tall, steel frame, built on the raised grade. The foundation they'd created by lifting the city allowed the skyscraper to exist. The fire was a catastrophe. 300 dead, $200 million in damage, 1/3 of the city in ruins. But it proved something the engineers had known all along. The raising of Chicago wasn't about saving the buildings. It was about saving the ground beneath them, about creating a foundation that could support a real city. A city with drainage, with sewers, with the infrastructure to grow past 250,000 people. The buildings they lifted, they were just scaffolding, temporary structures holding space while the city transformed underneath. And when the fire came, when those structures burned, the transformation was complete. The mud was gone. The grade was fixed. The foundation was set. Chicago would never drown again. Chapter 5. The iron still rests beneath. There's a training academy now on DeKoven Street, where the fire started, where the city burned. It's for the Chicago Fire Department. They teach firefighters there how to fight modern blazes, how to save structures that won't burn like wood. A sculpture stands outside. Tongues of Flame by Egan Weiner, bronze, 2 stories tall, commemorates the Great Fire. Reminds everyone what can happen when a city ignores the fundamentals, when infrastructure fails, when planning falls short. But the real monument isn't a building. It's beneath your feet. If you walk through downtown Chicago today, if you stand on Randolph and Dearborn or Lake and LaSalle, you're standing 6 to 14 feet higher than the original settlers did. The street beneath you is built on filled dirt, and beneath that dirt are the sewers Chesbro designed, brick tunnels wide enough to walk through, gravity-fed drains that still carry water to the Chicago River. Those sewers are why Chicago exists, not the skyscrapers, not the architecture, the sewers. Because without them, the city would still be drowning, still burying children to cholera, still watching typhoid sweep through every summer. The modern city processes 2 billion gallons of wastewater every day. The Metropolitan Water Reclamation District, successor to Chesbro's Board of Sewerage Commissioners, manages tunnels that dwarf the original brick sewers. Some of them are 30 feet in diameter, carved through bedrock, part of a system that cost billions. But it all started with those first brick tunnels, the ones they built on top of the old streets, the ones that necessitated raising an entire city. The jack screws are gone, melted down probably, reforged into railroad ties or building frames or whatever iron was worth in the 1870s. You can find a few in museums, small ones, replicas, educational models, but the 6,000 screws that lifted the Lake Street block, the 200 that raised that first building on Randolph, they're gone. The men who turned them, also gone. No records, no names, just labor rolls that listed crew and laborers and gave no details. The Irish immigrants, the German workers, the men who earned $3 a day to stand beneath 35,000 tons of suspended masonry. History forgot them. George Pullman went on to design railroad sleeping cars, made millions, built a company town south of Chicago, became one of the most famous industrialists in America. The Pullman strike of 1894 made him infamous, but he'd started by turning screws beneath buildings. James Hollingsworth continued raising buildings until his death, never became famous, never made Pullman's fortune, just kept lifting structures until there were no more to raise. Ellis Chesbrough resigned as Commissioner of Public Works in 1879, went to New York to consult on the Croton Aqueduct, died in 1886. He's buried at Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. His grave marker mentions the sewers, doesn't mention the raising. Most people don't connect the two, but the work remains, the grade remains. The elevation that shouldn't have been possible, that every engineer said couldn't be done, remains. Chicago still sits on a swamp, still barely rises above Lake Michigan, but it doesn't flood anymore. The water drains, the sewers work, and if you dig down through the modern streets, through the layers of asphalt and concrete and fill dirt, you'll find the old foundations, the timber beams they slid beneath the buildings, the pockets where the jack screws rested, the ghost marks of the grid that held 35,000 tons in the air. Some buildings never got raised. Out in the neighborhoods, away from downtown, you can still find them. Pilsen has dozens. Homes where the first floor became the basement, where the old ground level sits 6 feet below the sidewalk. You walk past and see stairs leading down to what looks like a basement entrance. It's not. It's the front door, the original grade, the level the city used to be. In some places you can still see the layering, old foundations exposed during construction, the original street level, then the fill dirt, then the new street, geological strata marking Chicago's transformation. They don't make plans like that anymore. Don't attempt engineering that insane. These days, if a city has drainage problems, they dig tunnels, pump stations, deep bore systems. They don't lift the city. But in 1858, that wasn't an option. The technology didn't exist, the money wasn't there, and people were dying. So they did the only thing they could. They jacked the buildings into the sky, 1/4 turn at a time, and prayed the threads would hold. And they did. For 10 years, across 50-plus buildings, through lifts that newspapers called miracles, the screws held. Not a single recorded collapse, not a single building failure, not a single worker crushed beneath the weight. The mathematics were perfect, the engineering was sound, the execution was flawless. 600 men turned 6,000 screws in perfect synchronization and lifted an acre of city into the air. People shopped in those buildings, slept in those buildings, conducted business while balanced on threaded iron rods. The fire took the buildings, but the city survived. Because the engineers hadn't built monuments, they'd built a foundation. Chicago rose out of the mud, and it never sank back. Every city that came after learned from Chicago. Every modern drainage system traces its lineage back to Chesbrough's sewers. Every urban planner who talks about raising the grade or improving drainage is echoing the solution Chicago pioneered in 1858. The impossible became possible. The unthinkable became routine. And the city that shouldn't have survived, the city built on a swamp, the city drowning in its own filth, became the second largest metropolis in America, all because 600 men turned 6,000 screws, quarter turn by quarter turn, day after day, until the weight of an entire city rested on new foundations. They're gone now, the men, the machines, the buildings they raised, but the foundation remains, beneath the skyscrapers, beneath the streets, beneath the modern city. Chicago still stands on their work, and it always will.